The former home of Queen frontman Freddie Mercury is for sale in London. Built in 1907, the Kensington property features a bar, a library.
Behind a plain green door on a quiet street in Kensington sits a house that once belonged to one of the most flamboyant performers rock music has ever produced. To passers-by, it looks unremarkable, tucked behind high walls and old trees, giving nothing away. But for 30 years, that house held the private universe of a man the world knew as a god of the stage and almost nothing about as a human being. When Freddie Mercury died in November 1991, the people closest to him stepped inside his home to confront not just grief, but a version of him that had never been seen in public, one built from silence, secrecy, and an almost desperate need for a place where he did not have to perform. Freddie was born Farrokh Bulsara in 1946 on the island of Zanzibar, into a Parsi family that had roots in Gujarat, India, and carried the customs of Zoroastrianism wherever they settled. His father worked for the British colonial administration, and the household ran on discipline and tradition, a stark contrast to the persona the world would later associate with the Mercury name. As a boy, he was sent to boarding school near Bombay, where classmates remember a quiet, almost withdrawn child who came alive only at the piano. He formed his first band there as a young teenager, playing rock and roll covers with a confidence that seemed to belong to someone twice his age. It was at that school that he began asking friends to call him Freddie, quietly discarding the name his family had given him years before anyone had heard of Queen. Political violence forced the Bulsara family to flee Zanzibar in the mid-1960s, and they resettled in England with almost nothing. The teenager who had once dreamed at a piano in India now found himself in the grey suburbs outside London, studying art and design while working odd jobs to get by. He handled luggage at Heathrow Airport and sold second-hand clothing at a market stall, all while nursing an obsession with music that refused to let go of him. Every band he joined in those years eventually fell apart, and by most measures, his early 20s looked like a string of failures rather than the beginning of a career. He never seemed to see it that way. Each collapsed group seemed only to sharpen his sense of exactly what kind of performer he intended to become. That certainty paid off when he joined two musicians who would become his creative partners for the rest of his career. Their band needed a new name, and while his bandmates hesitated, Freddie pushed hard for something bold and unapologetic. He wanted a word that sounded regal, theatrical, and impossible to ignore, and so Queen was born. Around the same time, he formally abandoned his birth name and became Freddie Mercury on paper as well as on stage, a transformation that felt less like reinvention and more like finally becoming who he already was. He even designed the band's now famous crest himself, folding each member's astrological sign into an ornate coat of arms, evidence that his creative instincts extended far beyond songwriting. On stage, Freddie Mercury was unlike anyone else performing at the time. His voice moved between a rich baritone and a piercing tenor with a flexibility that still puzzles vocal experts, and he threw himself into performance with a theatrical intensity that turned stadiums into intimate spaces. He wrote across musical genres seemingly without effort, moving from an operatic multipart epic to a stripped-down rockabilly tune within the same album, always restless, always resistant to repeating himself. He often admitted that he could barely read sheet music, composing instead by instinct at the piano, letting melodies arrive and rearrange themselves until they felt right. His most famous moment came not on a studio recording, but in front of a crowd, when Queen's short set at a massive charity concert in the summer of 1985 became one of the most celebrated live performances in the history of popular music, a set so tightly controlled and emotionally overwhelming that critics still return to it as a standard against which every arena performance is measured. Yet the further Freddie's fame stretched, the more fiercely he guarded what remained of his private life. In 1980, at the height of Queen's success, he purchased a Georgian house in Kensington for roughly £500,000. He called it Garden Lodge, and it quickly became far more than an address. He personally oversaw every detail of its transformation, filling the rooms with warm saffron-colored walls, Japanese antiques, and art that reflected decades of careful collecting. The two-story drawing room housed a grand piano, the instrument on which some of his most ambitious songs eventually took shape. Behind a mirrored dressing room upstairs sat his bedroom, the one space in the house reserved entirely for rest rather than performance. Outside, he designed sweeping gardens in a Japanese style, complete with magnolia trees, still water, and carefully sculpted greenery, an almost startling contrast to the loud excess people associated with his public image. Friends who visited often remarked that stepping through the property's green door felt like entering another world entirely, one governed by calm rather than spectacle. It was inside this house that his closest circle began to understand who Freddie really was once the cameras stopped rolling. He kept cats the way other people keep children, reportedly calling home during tours just so someone could hold the phone up to their ears. His favorite among them inspired one of his more tender songs, a rare public acknowledgement of a devotion that otherwise stayed almost entirely private. He surrounded himself with only a handful of trusted people inside those walls, including his personal assistant, his long-term partner, and Mary Austin, a woman who had been central to his life since the earliest days of his career, and who remained one of his most steadfast companions until his final breath. Freddie met Mary Austin in the late 1960s, when he was still an unknown musician selling clothing at a market stall, and she worked at a fashionable boutique nearby. Their relationship deepened quickly, and for years she quietly supported him financially while he chased a career that had not yet begun to pay off. When success finally arrived, he proposed, and for a time the two lived as an engaged couple. That arrangement eventually gave way to an honest conversation in which Freddie acknowledged his attraction to men, and though the romantic relationship ended there, the bond between them never truly broke. Mary stayed close for the rest of his life, working alongside him professionally, and remaining one of the very few people he trusted without hesitation. He referred to her as his closest confidant, and when he died, he left her garden lodge along with a substantial portion of his estate, a decision that spoke volumes about how deeply he valued her loyalty. His romantic life beyond Mary was far more complicated than the public understood at the time. He had relationships with several women over the years, including performers and public figures, who rarely spoke about their connection to him afterward. He also had significant relationships with men, some of which he kept almost entirely hidden from public view. The person who became his true long-term partner was Jim Hutton, an Irish hairdresser he met at a London nightclub in the mid-1980s. Their relationship lasted until Freddie's death, and Hutton later described a domestic life at Garden Lodge that looked almost nothing like the wild image fans associated with the singer, one built instead around quiet routine, mutual care, and eventually the exhausting demands of illness. Freddie wore a wedding band Hutton gave him for the rest of his life, a small and largely unnoticed detail that nonetheless said everything about how seriously he regarded that relationship. Behind the parties and the headlines, Freddie's health had already begun to decline years before the public knew anything was wrong. He was diagnosed with HIV in the mid-1980s, but chose to keep the information almost entirely private, sharing it only with a tight circle of people he trusted completely. His bandmates have said they sensed something was wrong long before he ever confirmed it, describing an unspoken agreement within the group not to press him for details he clearly did not want to share. He continued recording and performing as long as his body allowed, determined to keep working rather than be defined by illness. It was only on the day before his death, in November 1991, that he finally issued a public statement confirming his diagnosis, choosing the timing and the wording entirely on his own terms. He died the following day, at the age of 45, having controlled the narrative around his illness until almost the very last moment of his life. After his death, Garden Lodge became something closer to a sealed vault than an ordinary home. Mary Austin, who inherited the property, chose to preserve it almost exactly as Freddie had left it, as though he might return at any moment to sit down at his piano. For decades, she declined to significantly alter the rooms, allowing the house to function as an unofficial record of his taste, his habits, and the private world he had built for himself away from the public eye. When she eventually decided to part with thousands of his personal belongings through a major auction, the scale of what emerged startled even longtime fans. Handwritten lyrics surfaced alongside elaborate stage costumes, rare artwork, and deeply personal items that had never been shown publicly before. Among the most striking pieces was a replica crown and velvet robe he had worn during a mid-1980s tour, a theatrical gesture that captured his playful embrace of his own stardom. Even the property's iconic green door itself became a sought-after artifact, having been covered over the years with handwritten tributes, notes, and messages left by fans who had never met him but felt they somehow knew him. When that door eventually sold, it fetched a sum nearly equal to what Freddie had originally paid for the entire house decades earlier. What struck those closest to him most once they had time to properly absorb the contents of Garden Lodge, was not the flamboyance of his belongings but the quiet consistency of his private tastes. The same man who could command tens of thousands of people with a single sustained note surrounded himself, in private, with calm gardens, gentle color palettes, cats, and a small number of relationships he protected fiercely from public scrutiny. The house told a story of contradiction that mirrored the man himself. Loud on stage but guarded at home, endlessly generous with an audience of strangers yet careful about who he let into his actual life. Friends who had known him for decades still found themselves surprised by details that emerged only after his death, evidence of just how effectively he had separated his public performance from his private reality. By the time Garden Lodge was finally listed for sale years later, its value had climbed to tens of millions of pounds, a reflection not just of its prime London location, but of the cultural weight the property had accumulated. Mary Austin, reflecting on her decades in the house, described it as a space filled with laughter and quiet peace, hoping that whoever eventually moved in would sense something of what she and Freddie had once shared there. For a man who spent much of his career surrounded by spectacle, the house he chose to call home stood as a quiet rebuttal to his public image, proof that behind every larger-than-life performance was a person who simply wanted somewhere private to rest, create, and be understood by the handful of people he trusted enough to let inside. More than 3 decades after his death, Freddie Mercury remains one of the most instantly recognizable figures in music history, remembered for a voice and a stage presence that few performers have ever matched. But the contents of Garden Lodge added another layer to that legacy, revealing a private world built on loyalty, routine, and a need for sanctuary that rarely made it into interviews or magazine profiles. What his closest friends discovered inside those walls was not a scandal or a secret meant to tarnish his memory, but a fuller, more human portrait of a man who had spent his public life as an unstoppable force and his private life quietly searching for peace behind a green door in Kensington. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.